In his book entitled Think Again, psychologist Adam Grant tells the story of Mike Lazaridis, who is the creator of the BlackBerry. Anybody here have a BlackBerry? I'm going to reveal your age. Had a BlackBerry, Richard? Yeah, a couple people did. I had one back in the day. It's a story about changing our minds or not. So Lazaridis dropped out of college a couple of months before he was due to finish his electrical engineering degree. He had a revolutionary new idea, a device that combined phone and email that you could keep in your pocket. And from 2006 to 2011, the company went gangbusters. Here's the growth curve. Sales of BlackBerry smartphones in million devices, and the peak there is in 2011. And then a decline. Does anybody know why? Why did BlackBerry decline? Bear, do you know? What kind of smartphone in particular? The iPhone. The iPhone came out, and BlackBerry became kind of a thing of the past. So Mike Lazaridis had one good idea, but he wasn't able to change his mind so that his company could adapt to the changes in the market. So the ability to change our minds, to change our convictions, to change our direction in life has real-world consequences. That graph represents a whole lot of lost money. In our ever-changing worlds, innovation has to be part of the road to success, and innovation requires change. So that's true in the business world, and it's true just about anywhere else. The change is as certain as death and taxes. Corey, you can take that down. But if change is such a big part of life, why are we so resistant to it? Change is hard. Well, basically because our brains are like the soup Nazi from Seinfeld. You know, the soup Nazi, he has from the show Seinfeld. I'm aging myself here, but there's this owner of a soup shop who makes delicious, amazing varieties of soup. And there's a specific protocol that customers need to follow if you want the soup Nazi to serve you soup. And the hilarity of the show evolves as certain characters in the show Seinfeld can't bring themselves to do what the soup Nazi requires. And so he says, no soup for you. 1 year, Elaine gets no soup for 1 year because she had to express her dislike of lima beans to the soup Nazi. This is what our brains are like. Inflexible. Our brains are inflexible. Adam Grant, again, in his book, Think Again, talks about this part of ourselves that psychologists call the totalitarian ego. The totalitarian ego. We have this part of us that keeps out any information that would threaten our core beliefs. So a new idea comes along that conflicts with what we already know to be true or how we all have already ordered our lives. And the it's really hard to say, totalitarian ego swoops in with this mental armor that we can put on that blocks us from this new information so that we can stay in our lane, so that our brains don't have to adapt. And we become obstinate. It comes in the form of mental biases. We're predisposed to believe something that agrees with what we already know to be true. We're predisposed to want to sign on to something that fits with what we want to be true. And in this way, we stay safe as a species. Because when we all agree on something, then we can be safer within our tribe. It's an evolutionary need in addition to a neurological need to stay the same, not to change our minds about things. But then there comes the truth that we're wrong a lot of the time. We're wrong about things just because we are. We need to change. We need to change our minds sometimes. In this rapidly changing world, I've often talked about the 500-year shift that historian Phyllis Tickle suggests that we are in the middle of, that cultures, societies, religions undergo these major changes every 500 years or so, in which the old ideas stop working and something new is required to meet the new realities of the world. And if it's true that we are in the midst of one of these 500-year shifts, change is necessary. I mean, as the climate changes, we're doomed if we don't change some of how we act, some ways in which we operate in the world. We need to change. We need to change. So here's the disruptive good news of the gospel today. The disruptive good news. And this is a quote from Sarah Bessey, who just had a new book come out called Field Notes from the Wilderness. The good news is you will change. Make your peace with it. You will change. Make your peace with it. So our story from the book of Acts today, we're following the lectionary through the book of Acts, comes at another time of a 500-year shift. It was shortly after the time of Jesus, and there's two people in the story that need to have their minds changed in order to meet the future. Saul, who becomes Paul later, and Ananias. There's two people whose minds need to change in the story. So let's dive into the story from Acts chapter 9 and learn about how God changes our minds. So we begin with Saul, who was about to become Paul. And we'll just start reading. Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any who belonged to the way, that was the name for people who had decided to follow Jesus, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. So Saul was a Jew. Saul was a passionate Jew, a Jew with a lot of power who saw that the growing movement of Jesus followers was a tremendous threat to everything that the Judaism had built to their precarious peace in the midst of the Roman Empire. He believed deeply that the way of Jesus and the followers of the way of Jesus were a threat. And so he is working his way through the area to collect these followers of Jesus and bring them to Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was a place where there was quite a bit of persecution of the Jews. We'll pick it up again at verse 3. Now, he was going along and approaching Damascus. He's on the road approaching Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Why? Why are you hurting me, Saul? Why are you doing this?" And in this voice of the one who has been oppressed, the one who is being beaten down through his followers, I hear the voice of people like Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and Patrick Lyoya and Matthew Shepard and so many others on the margins who have found themselves being bound by people with power because there's a perception that they threaten something. Jesus' voice becomes the voice of the oppressed, of everyone, everywhere, in all times and in all places who has been oppressed. Why are you doing this to me? It's a question. So just take note of that for now. There are lots of ways that Jesus could have approached Saul, but it was with a question. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And picking it up again at we won't. Actually, I'm going to talk about that right now. He asks a question. There are so many ways that he could have approached Saul, in this situation. He could have preached at him. He could have tried to persuade him. He could have tried to prosecute him. Why? What are you doing? This is wrong. You're doing the wrong thing. Or he could have tried to be sort of convincing and try to change his mind by some tack. But Jesus asks a question. Jesus approaches Paul with curiosity, not with rage, not with anything other than a curiosity. Why? Why are you doing this? Verse 5, Saul asked, "Who are you, Lord?" And the reply came, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. Remember that sentence that Jesus said, "Whatever you do unto the least of these, you do unto me." Paul asks, "Who are you, Lord?" He recognizes something happening there. Lord and Jesus become one in his mind. He becomes aware that Jesus is Lord in the way that Jesus responds to the question. And then Jesus continues with some instructions. "But get up and enter the city." This is verse 6. "Get up and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do." I wonder if Paul needed some convincing that he should listen to this voice, or was he thinking yeah, I don't know if that's a good idea, or was he I don't have any choice, I have to listen to this voice? But let's keep reading. He does listen. "The men who were traveling with him stood speechless because they heard the voice, but saw no one. Saul got up from the ground, and though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. For 3 days he was without sight and neither ate nor drank." We are reluctant to change our minds. We are tragically reluctant to change our minds. But we do along the way, most of us. And it's often, Richard Rohr says, it's often great love or great suffering, and especially suffering, that is a universal path of God's way of reaching us and changing us. Great love or great suffering are how God often changes us, and especially suffering. And so Paul is sitting with that line, "I am Jesus whom you are persecuting." He can't see, he can't eat, he can't drink. And in the suffering of blindness and darkness and hunger and thirst and shame, God is reaching him to change his mind. And then we meet the other person the other person who needs to have their mind changed, the other person who's already a follower of Christ, who's already converted, who's already changed his life to become a follower of Jesus, but he's not done changing. Sarah Bessey says, again in her book, what was the name of the book? Field Notes. Sarah Bessey says that we've been taught that faith isn't meant to be moved. Our faith isn't meant to be moved, but she says, be moved. So here's how Ananias, a disciple in Damascus, changes his mind. This is verse 10. There was a disciple in Damascus named Ananias. The Lord said to him in a vision, Ananias. And he answered, here I am, Lord. The Lord said to him, get up and go to the street called Straight, and at the house of Judas, look for a man of Tarsus named Saul. At this moment, he's praying, and he has seen in a vision a man named Ananias come in and lay his hands on him so that he might regain his sight. But Ananias answered, Lord, I've heard from many about this man, how much evil he's done to your saints in Jerusalem. And here he has the authority from the chief priest to bind all who invoke your name. Ananias has a totalitarian ego too. And that ego kicks in and says, danger, danger, and puts on the mental armor because there is such a great threat to Ananias and what he knows to be true about the world and the danger that he would put himself in if he went to the home where this Christ follower killer was. No way, God, I am not doing that. That is a bad idea. Have you ever said that to God? That's not a good idea. Not going to do that. But God has an agenda. God has an agenda that does not involve Ananias's totalitarian ego, and that agenda is that the gospel would spread from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria to the ends of the world. God's agenda doesn't just stop with Ananias believing in Jesus. God's agenda requires him to keep changing his mind. God doesn't just want individuals to believe in and follow Jesus in their own neat little circles. God has an agenda to use us to spread the gospel from Judea to Samaria to the ends of the world. And so, this is verse 15, the Lord keeps talking to Ananias. Go, for he's an instrument whom I've chosen to bring my name before Gentiles and kings and before the people of Israel. I myself will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name. Whew. I feel a lot of satisfaction there, like, yes, like Saul's gonna pay for what he did. And maybe just trying to take that off Ananias' heart. Like, that's not your job to make him suffer for my name. That's my job. I don't know that God really acts like that, but my totalitarian ego is satisfied with that statement. So Ananias went and entered the house. Can you imagine the vulnerability and the fear that Ananias must have felt entering the house where Saul was? He laid his hands on Saul and he said, Brother Saul, he's already a brother. The first words that come out of Ananias' mouth reveal the courage that he has to allow God to change his mind about who this guy named Saul is. Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on your way here, has sent me so that you may regain your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit. And immediately, something like scales fell from his eyes and his sight was restored. Then he got up and was baptized. And after taking some food, he regained his strength. And let's keep going through the middle of verse 19. For several days, he, Paul, was with the disciples in Damascus. And immediately he began to proclaim Jesus in the synagogue, saying, "He is the Son of God." He was supposed to go to the synagogues to find the followers of Christ and bind them and take them to Jerusalem. And instead, he's going into synagogues saying, Jesus is the Son of God. Can you imagine what it must have been like for him? That first time he went into the synagogue, he was accustomed to going into the synagogue with vengeance and with his totalitarian ego leading. And now he's going in with a message of love from a place of humility. Verse 21, all who heard him were amazed and said, "Is not this the man who made havoc in Jerusalem among those who invoked his name? Among those who invoked this name? And has he not come here for the purpose of bringing them bound before the chief priests?" Saul became increasingly more powerful and confounded the Jews who lived in Damascus by proving that Jesus was the Messiah. Paul and Ananias they were enemies. And they both needed to have their minds changed in order for God's agenda to be made real. Because there were things that Paul could uniquely do that nobody else would do. And there were things that were unique about Ananias that allowed him to take the risk to go to Saul's house, the house where Saul was staying. So what are you uniquely positioned to do? And how do you need to change your mind in order for God to be able to do it? What are you uniquely positioned to do because of who you are, how you're wired, who you're connected to? What are you uniquely positioned to do to spread God's love in a certain way, in a certain place that no one else can do? And how does your mind need to change? You will change. Make your peace with it, Sarah Bessey says. Make your peace with it so that you can allow God to change your mind. There's lots of, maybe God will appear to you on the road. Jesus apparently loves to appear on the road to places. Maybe Jesus will appear to you with a flash of light, and please not with blindness. As your pastor, I don't want bad things to happen to you. Maybe Jesus will appear to you in that way, or maybe Jesus has appeared to you in that way and changed your life in one moment, changed your mind in one moment, and now you're on a new path. Or maybe God will appear to you in a vision like God did to Ananias, but maybe it's something else. And maybe it will require for you to do something first. I don't know. But what I do know is that in our rapidly changing world, people need the good news of God's love in a way that it has not been brought to them before. The old ways of doing church, the old ways of what some would call evangelizing, the old ways of outreach aren't working anymore. And we need to change to keep up with how the Spirit wants to move in these new realities. And so I leave you with one challenge. Well, I'm going to leave you with communion too. That's even better. One challenge and then communion. And the challenge is, what is the question that you need to ask? Jesus approached Paul with a question. Why are you persecuting me? And so what is the question? What is the question that you need to open up to? Whether it's a question being asked of you or a question that you need to ask someone else, what is the question? Can you move from being certain about everything? Can you move from the totalitarian ego's mental armor? Can you move from that into the vulnerability of a question? Will you join me in prayer? God, as we wonder what you have uniquely positioned us to do, because of how we're wired, who we are, where we're situated in the world, as we wonder about that, put a question in our hearts. Whether that's a question that needs to grow within us or a question that's being asked of us that we need to open the doors to. Help us to see our world as you see it, with a future that's drenched in divine desire, so that we can be a people whose minds can be changed for our good and for the good of your world. Amen.